At the store, I paid for an elderly woman's groceries because her card was declined. She leaned in, gripping my wrist with a strength that surprised me, and whispered, "When your son heads out tomorrow, do not touch the snow in the yard near the old oak tree." I laughed it off at the moment, thinking she was senile. But 24 hours later, standing on my back porch with a shovel in my hand, staring at that patch of white powder, I realized that stranger had just saved my life. If I had taken one step onto that snow, I would have been blown to pieces. If you are listening to this and you think your family is your safest haven, take a deep breath. My name is Lucas Callahan, and I am about to tell you how the people I raised tried to turn my own home into my grave. If this story chills you to the bone, please hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments which city you are watching from. I need to know there are still decent people out there. It started on a Tuesday evening that felt colder than usual, even for a Chicago winter. I was standing in line at Walmart, just picking up some rock salt and a few frozen dinners. The line was moving forcefully slow, the kind of slow that makes you grind your teeth. In front of me stood a woman who looked like she had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for 80 years. Her coat was threadbare, a dull gray wool that had seen better decades, and she was counting out coins on the conveyor belt. The cashier, a young girl with bored eyes and chewing gum loud enough to be heard in the parking lot, sighed dramatically. She tapped her long acrylic nails on the register. "Lady, the card is declined. Again. You are short $12.50. You need to put something back or step aside. People are waiting." The old woman flinched as if she had been slapped. She looked at the meager pile of goods: a loaf of bread, 2 cans of soup, a bag of cat food, a carton of milk. Essentials. There was no luxury here to put back. Her hands, shaking with a tremor that looked like Parkinson's, hovered over the cat food. I saw a tear trace a path through the deep wrinkles of her cheek. I could not stand it. I spent 40 years as a construction foreman, managing crews of 200 tough men building skyscrapers that scrape the Chicago clouds. I have zero tolerance for bullies, and I have even less tolerance for people humiliating the elderly. I stepped forward and slammed my hand on the counter, maybe a little harder than I intended. "Leave it," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the store. "Keep the cat food. Keep all of it." I pulled out my credit card and inserted it into the machine before the cashier could roll her eyes at me again. "Add my items to her tab. I am paying for everything." The total came to $156. I did not blink. I have worked hard my whole life. My pension is good. I am not rich, but I am not going to let a grandmother starve over $12. The cashier finalized the transaction in silence, handing me the long receipt. The old woman looked at me. Her eyes were a piercing, watery blue, incredibly sharp for her age. She looked at the receipt. Then she looked at my wallet, which I had left open on the counter. Her gaze locked onto my veteran ID card, the one with my full name, Lucas Callahan, printed clearly next to the Marine Corps emblem. Her demeanor changed instantly. The gratitude in her face vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. She looked around the store, scanning the faces of the people behind us, as if checking if we were being watched. Then she grabbed my arm. Her fingers were ice cold, digging into the sleeve of my jacket. "Lucas Callahan," she breathed. Her voice was barely a whisper, rough like sandpaper. I nodded, confused. "Yes, ma'am." "Do I know you?" She did not answer my question. She pulled me down slightly, forcing me to lean in so only I could hear her. Her breath smelled of peppermint and fear. "Listen to me closely," she hissed, her eyes darting back and forth. "I know who you are. I know Brandon. I know what they are planning. When your son leaves tomorrow, do not touch the snow in the yard. Especially not near the big oak tree. Do not let anyone shovel it. Do not step on it. It is a trap, Mr. Callahan. If you touch it, you will lose everything." Before I could ask her what on earth she was talking about, she let go of my arm and bolted. For a woman of her age, she moved with surprising speed, disappearing into the chaotic crowd of shoppers near the exit. I stood there holding my bag of rock salt, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Brandon. How did she know my son's name? And why would she warn me about snow? It sounded like the ramblings of a confused mind, but the intensity in her eyes was too real. It was the look of someone who had seen a ghost. I walked to my truck, the wind biting at my face. The drive home was treacherous. The blizzard was picking up, turning the world into a white blur. My windshield wipers were working overtime, slashing back and forth like a metronome, counting down the seconds to something I could not see coming. As I gripped the steering wheel, my mind replayed the morning's events. Suddenly, the pieces started to click together, forming a picture I did not want to see. Just this morning, my son Brandon and his wife Tiffany had announced a surprise trip. They were packing to go to Aspen for a week. A ski trip. It made no sense. Brandon had been complaining about money for months. He had asked me for loans 3 times this year, claiming his startup investments were just temporarily tied up. I knew better. I knew the look of a gambler chasing losses, but I gave him the money anyway, because he is my only child. And now suddenly, they had the cash for a luxury week in Aspen, but it was what Tiffany had said to me before I left for the store that now echoed in my head, loud and alarming. She had hugged me a little too tightly, her perfume cloying and sweet. "Oh, Dad," she had said, flashing that smile that never quite reached her eyes. "The forecast says this storm is going to be brutal. Please promise me you won't go out to the backyard. I know you like to keep everything tidy, but Brandon and I hired a professional service to clear the snow while we are gone. Especially near the old oak tree, the roots make the ground uneven. I don't want you slipping and breaking a hip. Just stay inside. Okay? We want you safe." At the time, I thought she was just being overprotective or maybe condescending, treating me like a fragile antique. But now, combined with the stranger's warning, her words sounded different. They sounded like a script. "Hired a professional service," I snorted in the empty cab of my truck. Tiffany would not spend a dime on a service if I could do the work for free. She calls me cheap, but she is the one who counts every penny of my money, while spending hers on designer handbags. Truth be told, I should have spotted the rot setting in a month ago. One evening, Tiffany slapped a thick folder on the coffee table, wearing a mask of fake concern. "Dad," she said, her voice dripping with poisonous honey. "Brandon and I are worried about your memory. We think it's time you signed a power of attorney over to Brandon, just as a precaution." I laughed in her face and tossed the folder into the fireplace. I told her my memory was sharper than both of theirs combined. I remember every grandchild's birthday, while Brandon forgets his own anniversary. But the look in Tiffany's eyes as she watched that paper turn to ash wasn't disappointment. It was hatred. Cold calculation. I thought it was just greed then. I didn't realize that when she couldn't get my signature with words, she'd be willing to take my life with gas. I pulled into the driveway of the house I built with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. It is a sturdy log cabin-style home sitting on 2 acres of land on the outskirts of the city. I poured the foundation myself. I framed every wall. I planted that oak tree in the backyard when Brandon was just a baby. That tree and I have weathered decades of storms. The house was dark except for the porch light. Brandon's car was in the driveway, covered in a fresh layer of snow. They were leaving early tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. I sat in my truck for a moment, the engine idling. I looked at the side of the house towards the backyard. The snow was piling up, pristine and white, covering the ground in a thick blanket. It looked peaceful. It looked innocent. But for the first time in my life, I looked at my own home and felt a shiver of danger. I am a man who understands structure. I know that if the foundation is rotten, the house will fall no matter how good the paint looks. And right now I had a sinking feeling that the rot in my family had gone deeper than I ever imagined. I turned off the ignition and stepped out into the storm. I was not going to sleep tonight. If there was something buried under that snow, I was going to find it. And if my son and his wife were planning something, they were about to learn that you do not mess with a man who has spent his life building things that are designed to withstand the strongest winds. I gripped my grocery bag tighter. The old woman said it was a trap. Well, I have never been the kind of animal that steps blindly into a snare. I am the hunter, and tonight the hunt begins. I pushed open the heavy oak front door, shaking the snow off my boots on the mat I had placed there 10 years ago. Normally coming home was a relief, a moment to listen to the silence of the house I built. But tonight, the air inside felt different. It was thick, heavy, and smelled wrong. It smelled like rosemary and roasted garlic. For most families, the scent of a home-cooked meal is a blessing. In my house, it was an anomaly, a red flag. My daughter-in-law, Tiffany, did not cook. In the 3 months they had been living with me, the kitchen had remained pristine, used only for reheating expensive takeout or opening bottles of wine. Yet here she was. I walked into the dining room to find the table set with my good china, the plates with the gold rim that my late wife Martha used to save for Christmas and Easter. Tiffany emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron I did not even know we owned. She was smiling. It was a wide, bright smile that showed too many teeth and did not create a single crinkle around her eyes. "Dad?" "You are home," she chirped, her voice an octave higher than usual. "I made pot roast. I know it is your favorite. Brandon and I thought we should have a nice family dinner tonight." I looked at Brandon. My son was sitting at the head of the table, a spot I usually occupied. He was pouring red wine into 3 glasses, but his hand was unsteady. A few drops of crimson splashed onto the white tablecloth. He quickly dabbed at it with a napkin, his movements jerky and frantic. "Hey, Dad," Brandon said, avoiding my gaze. He looked pale. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, despite the house being a comfortable 70 degrees. "Sit down. We have some news." I hung my coat on the rack, my mind racing. The old woman's warning from the grocery store was still ringing in my ears like a fire alarm. Do not touch the snow. Do not touch the snow. And now I walked into a scene that looked like a television commercial for a happy family. It was too perfect. It was staged. I sat down slowly, watching them. I have spent my life reading blueprints. I know when a wall is load-bearing and when it is just a facade. This dinner. It was a facade. I could feel the tension vibrating in the room, a low-frequency hum that made the hair on my arms stand up. So I said, unfolding my napkin, "What is the occasion? Did you finally find a job?" Brandon flinched. He hated when I brought up his employment status. He called himself an entrepreneur, but in my day, we called it unemployed. "No, Dad." "Not exactly," Brandon stammered, finally looking at me. His eyes were glassy. "Actually, Tiffany and we are taking a trip. Tomorrow." A trip, I repeated, keeping my voice flat. "Yes," Tiffany interjected, placing a steaming platter of meat in the center of the table. "We are going to Aspen. Just for a week. We need to reconnect, you know. The stress of the move, looking for investors. It has been a lot. We need some fresh mountain air. Aspen. One of the most expensive ski resort towns in the country. Last week, Brandon asked me for $200 to fix a flat tire. Now they were jetting off to Aspen. I cut a piece of the roast beef. It was dry, overcooked, but I chewed it methodically. "And you are leaving tomorrow?" I asked. "In the middle of a blizzard." "We have a 4-wheel drive," Tiffany said quickly. "We will be fine. We leave at 5 in the morning to beat the worst of it." "But Dad, that brings me to something important." "Here it comes." I tightened my grip on my fork. Tiffany leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Her expression shifted from fake cheerfulness to a mask of exaggerated concern. It was the kind of face a nurse makes before giving you a painful injection. Because of the storm, the backyard is going to be a mess, she said. I know how you are about the property. You like everything perfect. But please promise me you will not go out there to shovel, especially near the big oak tree. My heart stopped for a beat. There it was, the oak tree, the exact location the stranger had whispered to me less than an hour ago. Why, I asked, forcing myself to swallow the dry meat. It is just snow. I have shoveled this yard for 40 years. No, Dad, Tiffany insisted, reaching out to touch my hand. Her skin was cold. The ground near the oak tree is uneven. The roots are coming up. With the snow covering them, it is a hazard. You could slip. You could fall and break a hip. We would be all the way in Aspen and unable to help you. She paused, taking a sip of wine, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt predatory. So Brandon and I hired a service, she continued. A professional snow removal company. They are coming while we are away to handle everything, specifically the back patio and the area around the tree. They have heavy machinery. You do not need to lift a finger. In fact, just stay inside. Lock the doors, turn up the heat, and relax. Promise me, Dad, do not go near that tree. I looked at her. I looked at the concern painted on her face, hiding the malice underneath. It was a plausible lie. It made sense on the surface. An old man, a slippery yard, a caring daughter-in-law hiring help. If I had not met the woman at the store, I would have believed her. I would have been touched by her thoughtfulness. I promise I lied. I will stay inside. Tiffany let out a breath she seemed to have been holding. Her shoulders relaxed, but Brandon remained tense. He was staring at his plate, pushing peas around with his fork. He had not taken a single bite. He kept glancing at his expensive smartwatch, tapping the screen, checking notifications. "Who are you waiting to hear from, son?" I asked quietly. Brandon jumped, his fork clattering against the china. "No one. Just checking the weather report for the drive." Something was wrong. Not just the lie about the snow. Brandon was terrified. I could see the pulse jumping in his neck. I decided to test the structural integrity of this little performance. "Oops," I said, deliberately knocking my heavy silver spoon off the table. It clattered onto the hardwood floor. "Let me get that," I said. "No." "Dad, I will get it," Brandon said, starting to rise. "I am not an invalid, Brandon," I snapped, perhaps a little too sharply. I bent down, leaning under the table to retrieve the spoon. The tablecloth draped down, creating a hidden tent. In that private space beneath the table, the truth was revealed. I saw Brandon's legs. His right leg was bouncing up and down so violently it looked like a seizure. It was a piston of pure nervous energy. But it was what was between his feet that chilled me. He had a small travel bag tucked under his chair. Not a suitcase, a go bag. And sticking out of the side pocket was not a ski map or a pair of gloves. It was a passport. I grabbed the spoon and sat back up. My joints creaked, but my mind was razor sharp. You do not need a passport to go to Aspen, Colorado. You need a passport if you are planning to leave the country and never come back. I placed the spoon on the table and looked at my son. He was wiping sweat from his forehead again. "Are you okay, Brandon?" I asked. "You look like you are coming down with something." "I am fine," he said, his voice cracking. "Just excited about the trip." I looked at Tiffany. She was calmly slicing her meat, completely composed. She was the architect. He was just the laborer, and a scared one at that. They were not going on vacation. They were fleeing the scene of a crime that had not happened yet. They expected me to be dead by the time they reached their destination. The dinner continued in agonizing slowness. I ate every bite, fueling my body for what was coming. They talked about skiing, about hot cocoa, about the fireplace in the lodge. I nodded and smiled, playing the role of the oblivious, grateful father. Inside, however, the construction foreman was taking over. I was assessing the risks. I was calculating the angles. They thought I was the foundation they could crumble to build their new life. They forgot that I am the one who poured the concrete. I am the one who reinforced the steel. As Tiffany poured me another glass of wine, urging me to drink up and sleep well, I realized this was their goodbye. They did not plan to see me again. Very well, I thought, taking a sip of the bitter wine. You want me to stay away from the oak tree? You want me to stay inside? I will play your game. But tomorrow morning when you leave, the snow will not be the only thing that gets disturbed. I finished my meal, wiped my mouth, and looked at my son one last time with pity. He was selling his father for a plane ticket. But he forgot one thing. He forgot where he came from. He forgot that Callahan men do not break easy. Enjoy your trip, I said, standing up. I think I will turn in early. I am feeling very tired. Perfect, Tiffany said, her eyes gleaming. Sleep tight, Dad. Don't worry about a thing. I walked up the stairs, feeling their eyes burning into my back. I went into my bedroom and locked the door. But I did not get into bed. I went to the closet and pulled out my old work duffel bag. I took out my heavy-duty flashlight, my wire cutters, and my gloves. They told me not to touch the snow. That was my first mistake. You never tell a builder not to inspect the job site, especially when the ground is unstable. I sat in the dark, waiting for the sound of their car leaving the driveway. The long night was just beginning. At 5 in the morning, the house shook slightly as the garage door rumbled open. I stood by the window in the darkened living room, watching through the slats of the blinds. The blizzard had settled into a steady, silent fall of heavy flakes, painting the world in a deceptive purity. I saw the red taillights of Brandon's SUV cut through the darkness, pausing for a moment at the end of the driveway before turning onto the main road. They were gone. They were actually doing it. For a normal father, watching his son drive away for a vacation would bring a sense of quiet peace, perhaps a little loneliness. For me, it felt like the starting gun of a race for survival. I did not go back to bed. Sleep was a luxury for men who were not being hunted in their own homes. Instead, I went straight to the garage. I pulled down my old workbox from the top shelf. It was covered in a layer of dust, but the tools inside were oiled and ready. I took out my heavy-duty Carhartt jacket, the canvas stiff and stained with grease from years of job sites. I laced up my steel-toed boots, the leather cracked, but the soles still solid enough to kick down a door if needed. Finally, I grabbed my metal detector. It was an old model one I used to use to find property stakes and buried utility lines before breaking ground on a new project. I stepped out the back door, and the cold air hit me like a physical blow. The wind was howling now, whipping the snow into swirling devils that danced across the patio. The world was gray and white and hostile. I looked toward the old oak tree standing like a sentinel at the edge of the property. Tiffany had been so specific. Don't go near the oak tree. Do not touch the snow. I marched through the knee-deep drifts, fighting the wind. My breath plumed in front of me in white clouds. When I reached the tree, I stopped. To an untrained eye, the ground looked natural. The snow was piled high, smoothing over the imperfections of the earth. But I have spent 40 years looking at grade levels and soil compaction. I saw what they tried to hide. The snow here was not drifted naturally. It was packed. Someone had been here recently, digging and then filling it back in, patting the snow down to make it look undisturbed. It was sloppy work, amateur work, the kind of work done by someone who has never held a shovel for a living. I switched on the metal detector. The low hum of the device was the only sound in the desolate morning. I swept the coil over the suspicious patch of ground. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the static of the wind. Then suddenly, a high-pitched shriek pierced the air. It was loud, continuous. There was something metal down there, something substantial. I leaned the detector against the tree and grabbed my shovel. I did not dig wildly. I dug with precision, slicing into the packed snow and tossing it aside. 1 foot, 2 feet. The ground beneath the snow was frozen hard, but the soil here had been turned recently. It was loose, mixed with gravel. My shovel hit something with a dull thud. It was not a rock. It sounded hollow. I got down on my knees, ignoring the biting cold soaking through my jeans. I used my gloved hands to brush away the remaining dirt. What I saw made my blood run colder than the blizzard around me. It was a pipe. A bright orange PVC pipe about 2 inches in diameter. I stared at it, my mind racing through the catalog of building materials in my head. Orange pipe is typically used for telecommunications or power conduits. It is designed to protect wires. But as I cleared more dirt following the line of the pipe, I saw something that made no sense. The pipe was not running toward the street where the utility lines were. It was running in the opposite direction. It was snaking away from the oak tree buried shallowly under the frost line and heading in a straight, unwavering line directly toward the foundation of the house. I scrambled up and followed the path of the buried pipe, testing the ground with the heel of my boot. The snow was softer along this entire trajectory. They had dug a trench. They had laid this pipe all the way across the yard. I reached the side of the house right beneath the window of my bedroom on the first floor. I brushed the snow away from the foundation. The orange pipe disappeared into the wall, but it did not go through the concrete. It was fed into the external vent of my HVAC system. My heart hammered against my ribs. The intake vent. This vent was designed to pull fresh air from the outside and circulate it into the master bedroom to keep the air pressure balanced. It was a specific feature I had installed years ago for better climate control. I ran back to the oak tree, needing to see where this pipe started. I dug faster now, abandoning caution. I cleared the dirt around the base of the tree until I found the source. The orange pipe was connected to a valve, and that valve was tapped into a copper line that I recognized instantly. It was the main feed line from my underground propane tank. We live out in the country. We do not have city gas. We have a 500-gallon propane tank buried in the yard to run the heating and the stove. I sat back on my heels, the realization hitting me with the force of a wrecking ball. This was not a drainage pipe. This was a bypass. They had tapped into the main propane line, bypassing the safety regulators and the shut-off valves inside the house. They had run a direct high-pressure line from the tank through the orange PVC conduit straight into the air intake of my bedroom. I looked at the valve at the base of the tree. It was attached to a small battery-operated timer, the kind used for garden irrigation systems. I squinted at the digital display on the timer. It was counting down. Os 2. Os. 2 hours. In 2 hours, that timer would open the valve. Pure, odorless propane gas would rush through that orange pipe. It would flood into my bedroom while I was sleeping. Propane is heavier than air. It would fill the room from the floor up, silent and invisible. I would not wake up. I would simply suffocate in my sleep, or worse. Then I saw the second wire. Tape wrapped around the orange pipe was a thin pair of electrical wires. I followed them with my eyes. They ran parallel to the gas line, disappearing into the house foundation alongside the pipe. A spark. They were not just going to suffocate me. They were going to blow the house off its foundation. If the gas filled the room for an hour, reaching the critical explosive concentration, all it would take was a tiny spark. The timer was likely set to trigger a small ignition, or perhaps they had rigged something inside the vent. I stood up, swaying slightly. The cold was no longer bothering me. I was burning with a rage so intense it felt like I had swallowed fire. This was why Tiffany was so worried about me going outside. This was why she begged me to stay in bed. This was why they left at 5 in the morning. They wanted to be miles away, creating an airtight alibi on the highway to Aspen when the tragic accident occurred. Old man Callahan alone in his house during a blizzard. A gas leak. A faulty furnace. A spark. Boom. The house would be leveled. My body would be unidentifiable. The evidence of the orange pipe would be incinerated or buried under tons of burning debris. The fire marshal would call it a tragedy. Brandon would cry at the funeral, and then he would collect the insurance check. I looked at the house. My home. The place where I raised that boy. The place where I held his hand when he scraped his knee. The place where I taught him to ride a bike. He had turned it into a gas chamber. I looked down at the timer again. The numbers flickered in the gray light. 1 hour and 59 minutes. I reached out to rip the wires out to smash the timer with my shovel. My hand hovered inches from the device. No. If I destroyed it now, they would know. They would come back, or they would try again later. They would realize the old man was onto them, and next time they might just use a bullet. I needed them to believe their plan was working. I needed them to think I was still the clueless, loving father, sleeping soundly in his bed, waiting to die. I pulled my hand back. I carefully covered the timer with a piece of bark and smoothed the snow back over the trench near the tree, making it look exactly as it had before. I picked up my shovel and my metal detector. I turned and walked back toward the house. I was not going to stop the countdown. I was going to direct the explosion. They wanted fire, I would give them fire, but it would not be the kind they were expecting. I entered the house and locked the door behind me. The silence was no longer heavy. It was electric. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a pot of coffee. Black, strong. I had work to do, and I had exactly 1 hour and 58 minutes to turn this death trap into the most sophisticated cage a rat had ever stepped into. I took a sip of the scalding coffee and stared at the photo of Brandon on the mantel. "You want to play engineer, son?" I whispered to the empty room. "You want to learn about pressure and combustion? Fine. Class is in session." I knelt there in the snow, the wind biting at my exposed face, but I felt none of it. My world had narrowed down to the small, hollowed-out cavity at the base of the oak tree. I clicked on my flashlight, holding the beam steady with a hand that refused to shake. Inside the hollow, shielded from the elements by a piece of carefully placed bark, was the heart of the beast. It was a digital irrigation timer, the kind you buy at any hardware store for $20. But it was not wired to a sprinkler system. With the precision of a surgeon, or rather the foreman I had been for 40 years, I began to trace the lines. I did not touch anything yet. First you assess, then you act. The timer was wired to a solenoid valve. I recognized the make. It was a high-flow valve designed for industrial gas lines, not residential water. The input side was tapped directly into the main copper line coming from my underground propane tank. The output side fed into the orange PVC pipe running toward the house. I looked at the digital display. It was set for 2 a.m. That was the release time. At exactly 2 in the morning, while I would be deep in what they hoped was a drug-induced sleep from the wine, this valve would open silent and deadly. The propane would bypass every safety regulator in the house. It would rush through that orange pipe and flood into my bedroom vent. I did the math in my head. Propane is heavier than air. It sinks. It would pool on the floor first, filling the room from the bottom up like an invisible, suffocating ocean. By 2:30, the concentration would be high enough to kill me just by breathing. But they did not just want me dead. They wanted me erased. I followed a second set of wires. These were thinner, running from a separate channel on the timer. They ran parallel to the pipe, disappearing into the ground. I knew exactly where they went. They went to the spark igniter inside the vent. The timer for that circuit was set for 3 a.m. It was a masterclass in cruelty. They gave the gas exactly 1 hour to fill the room, to seep into the walls, to saturate the furniture. They wanted to ensure maximum saturation. When that spark hit at 3 a.m., it would not just be a fire. It would be a thermobaric explosion. The pressure wave alone would liquefy my internal organs before the fire even touched me. The roof would lift off. The walls would blow out. The house I built with my own hands would be reduced to splinters and ash in a fraction of a second. I sat back on my heels, the flashlight beam cutting a cone through the falling snow. I stared at the timer blinking. The numbers 020000 seemed to mock me. It was not just a mechanism. It was a message. It told me exactly how much my life was worth to them. The cost of a timer, some PVC pipe, and a tank of gas. My legs gave out. I did not choose to sit. Gravity simply claimed me. I collapsed right there in the snow, sitting cross-legged like a child. The cold seeped through my heavy work pants, freezing my skin, but the cold inside my chest was far worse. It was a hollow, aching void where my heart used to be. I looked at the house again. Through the swirling snow, I could see the window of Brandon's old bedroom on the second floor. I remembered the day we moved in. He was 5 years old. He was terrified of the dark. I spent 3 nights sleeping on the floor next to his bed, holding his hand until he fell asleep. I remembered the day he fell off his bike right here in this driveway. He scraped his knees raw. He was screaming, blood running down his shins. I scooped him up. I carried him inside. I cleaned the wounds while he sobbed into my shoulder. I put Superman Band-Aids on him and told him he was brave. I told him his dad would always be there to fix him up. I raised that boy. I taught him how to throw a baseball. I paid for his college. I bailed him out when he made mistakes. I loved him with a fierceness that only a father knows. And this was his repayment. He did not just want me gone. He wanted me to suffer. He wanted to blow me up. He sat at my dinner table, drank my wine, and looked me in the eye, knowing that in a few hours I would be nothing but charred bone fragments. The betrayal was physically painful. It felt like a serrated knife twisting in my gut. I gasped for air, tears hot and angry spilling onto my frozen cheeks. How could the boy I held in my arms turn into a monster who would rig a gas bomb to his own father's bedroom? Was it the money? Was $2 million in life insurance really worth the soul of the man who gave you life? I thought about Tiffany, her cold eyes, her fake smile. She was the architect, yes. But Brandon knew this yard. He knew this tree. He knew where the gas lines were because I showed him. I taught him the systems of this house so he could take care of it one day. And he used that knowledge to build my coffin. I sat there for what felt like an hour, letting the grief wash over me. I let myself mourn. I mourned the death of my son. Not the man driving to Aspen, but the boy I thought I knew. That boy died tonight. The man in that car was a stranger. A dangerous, greedy stranger. And then the tears stopped. The sorrow hardened into something else. It hardened into the cold, gray steel of a girder. I wiped my face with my rough glove. I stood up. My knees popped and my back ached, but I stood tall. I am Lucas Callahan. I survive. I build. And I do not let anyone tear down my foundation. I looked down at the timer. The impulse to smash it with my shovel was overwhelming. I wanted to rip the wires out, to scream, to destroy their evil little toy. But I stopped myself. If I destroyed it, the trap would fail. They would check the news tomorrow. They would see no explosion. They would know I found it. They would stay away, or worse, they would come back with a gun. They would claim innocence. They would say someone else must have planted it. Without the explosion, or at least the attempt of one, I had no proof of their intent. I had to catch them in the act. I needed them to believe they had succeeded. I took a deep breath and steadied my hands. I reached into my tool belt and pulled out my precision screwdriver and a pair of needle nose pliers. I did not cut the main wires. Instead, I carefully disconnected the feed to the solenoid valve. I rerouted the circuit, creating a bypass loop. I worked quickly, my fingers numb, but sure. I disconnected the connection to the propane tank, completely capping the line with a brass fitting I had in my pocket, sealing it tight so no gas could escape. Then I reconnected the orange pipe to the valve, but now the valve was connected to nothing but air. I moved to the spark timer. I located the wire leading to the igniter. I snipped it cleanly, stripping the ends and twisting them together with a small resistor I salvaged from my pocket flashlight. This would fool the timer into thinking the circuit was complete. The clock would keep ticking. The signals would be sent. but nothing would happen. To the naked eye, it looked untouched. The timer was still counting down. The wires were still buried. The pipe still ran to the house. I covered the hollow with the bark. I smoothed the snow over the disturbed ground using a pine branch to sweep away my footprints, backing away slowly until I reached the patio. I looked at my handiwork. It was a perfect counterfeit, a stage set for a tragedy that would never happen. "Let them think they are smart," I whispered into the wind. "Let them drive to Aspen, checking their watches, waiting for the boom." I turned back to the house. The grief was gone. Now there was only the mission. I had secured the perimeter. Now I had to prepare the interior. I checked my watch. I had time. I had a house to rig cameras to hide and a welcome party to prepare. They wanted heat, I would give them heat. But it wouldn't come from a gas explosion. It would come from the truth. And the truth burns hotter than any fire. I walked back into the warmth of the kitchen, but the house felt colder than the blizzard outside. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a crime scene. I had secured the perimeter and neutralized the immediate threat, but I still did not have the full picture. A man does not wake up one morning and decide to blow up his father for an insurance check unless he is desperate. I needed to know exactly what kind of desperation drives a son to murder. I headed straight for the room Brandon called his home office. He always kept the door locked, claiming he handled sensitive financial documents for high-profile clients. I used to respect his privacy. Today, I did not care about privacy. I cared about survival. I went to the garage and grabbed a thin flathead screwdriver. The lock on the office door was a cheap interior privacy lock, the kind you can pop open in 3 seconds if you know where the spring is. I had that door open before I even took a full breath. The room smelled of stale sweat and expensive cologne, a nauseating combination that smelled like anxiety. For a man who claimed to be a successful investor, his office was a disaster. Papers were scattered everywhere. Takeout boxes from weeks ago were piled in the corner. It looked like the inside of a mind that was unraveling. I sat down at his mahogany desk, a desk I had paid for as a graduation gift 10 years ago. I started opening drawers. The top ones were full of office supplies and useless stationery, but the bottom drawer on the right side was locked. I jammed the screwdriver into the gap between the drawer and the frame and applied leverage. Wood splintered. The lock popped with a sharp crack. I pulled the drawer open. Inside, there were no investment portfolios or client files. There was a stack of envelopes, thick and menacing. Most of them were unopened. I picked up the one on top. It had no return address, just a red stamp that said final notice. I tore it open. It was not from a bank. It was from a collection agency in Nevada that I knew was a front for something much darker. I read the letter. It was blunt. It was violent. It detailed a gambling debt that had spiraled out of control. I picked up another letter and another. They were all the same. Online poker, sports betting, underground casinos. The dates went back 3 years. I pulled out a legal pad where someone, presumably Tiffany, had tried to tally up the damage. The numbers were scribbled in red ink, circled and underlined with aggressive strokes. I followed the column down to the bottom. The final figure made the air leave my lungs. $850,000. My son did not just have a spending problem. He was drowning. He owed nearly $1 million to people who did not send lawyers to collect debts. They sent men with baseball bats. I sat back in the chair, the letter shaking in my hand. This explained everything. The sudden move to my house. The urgency. The trip to Aspen, which was clearly an escape route. They needed my life insurance money and the value of the land, not to live a life of luxury, but to buy their lives back. They were going to trade my life for theirs. I kept digging. I needed more than just motive. I needed a direct link. I shoved the debt letters aside and felt something stiff at the very bottom of the drawer. It was a photograph crumpled and smoothed out again, as if someone had thrown it away in anger and then retrieved it. I pulled it out. It was a picture of Brandon from a few years ago. He was standing on a pier, his arm draped around the shoulders of another young man. They were both laughing, holding up beer bottles, looking like they owned the world. I squinted at the other boy. He had sandy blonde hair and a smile that looked familiar. I turned the photo over. On the back in Brandon's handwriting it said, Brandon and Kyle, summer of 2018. Kyle. The name hit me like a physical blow. Kyle Higgins. My mind flashed back to the grocery store, to the trembling woman with the threadbare coat. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my phone. I had snapped a quick picture of the receipt I paid for her, mostly out of habit to track my expenses, but also because I wanted to remember the name of the person I helped. I pulled up the image and zoomed in. The name on the declined credit card receipt was Martha Higgins, but the address printed below it was for an apartment complex on the south side of the city, a rough area miles away from where we lived. Kyle Higgins. Martha Higgins. The woman in the store was not just a random psychic. She was Kyle's mother. I looked at the photo again. Brandon and Kyle looked like best friends. Brothers, even. So why was Kyle's mother warning me that my son was about to kill me? What happened between these two friends that left one mother destitute and one father facing a bomb? I stood up, shoving the photo and the debt letters into my jacket pocket. I needed answers. I could not get them from a dead phone line or a crumpled piece of paper. I needed to look Martha Higgins in the eye. I checked my watch. It was not even 7 in the morning yet. The countdown on the gas timer outside was ticking away, but I had disabled the mechanism. The house was safe for now. I grabbed my keys. I walked out to my truck. The blizzard was raging harder now, whiteout conditions that would keep most sane people indoors. But I was not sane anymore. I was a father on a warpath. I fired up the engine, the big diesel roaring to life. I shifted into 4-wheel drive and backed out of the driveway, glancing one last time at the snow-covered oak tree. It looked so innocent, so peaceful. I drove south. The roads were treacherous, covered in black ice and drifting snow. I passed cars spun out in ditches, but I kept my hands steady on the wheel. I drove with the precision of a man who has nothing left to lose. The city landscape changed as I drove. The manicured lawns of my neighborhood gave way to industrial parks, then to rows of cramped, dilapidated houses. I found the address from the receipt. It was a small, run-down bungalow with peeling paint and bars on the windows. The porch sagged under the weight of the snow. It was the kind of place where hope goes to die. I parked the truck and walked up the path, my boots crunching on the ice. I did not hesitate. I knocked on the door. 3 sharp raps. There was no answer. I knocked again, harder. Mrs. Higgins, I called out, my voice fighting the wind. It is Lucas Callahan, the man from the store. We need to talk. I heard the sound of a chain sliding back. The door cracked open a few inches. A slice of a face appeared. It was her. The blue eyes were wide with shock. You, she whispered. You should be dead. I am not dead, I said, pushing the door gently but firmly. And I am not going to be. But I found the pipe, Mrs. Higgins. And I found a photo of your son Kyle with my son Brandon. At the mention of Kyle's name, her face crumbled. She opened the door fully and stepped back, gesturing for me to come in. The house was freezing inside. She was wearing her coat, sitting next to a small space heater. I stepped inside and closed the door against the storm. Why did you warn me? I asked, standing in her small living room. And what did my son do to yours? She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw a reflection of my own pain, a pain that only a parent can understand, because she said, her voice trembling, Brandon killed my Kyle, not with a gun and not with gas, but he killed him just the same. And when I heard him on the phone in the parking lot yesterday, laughing about how he was going to do the same to you, I couldn't let him take another life. She pointed to a small shrine on the mantel, a framed photo of the boy from the picture, surrounded by unlit candles. "Sit down, Mr. Callahan," she said. "If you want the truth, you had better sit down. It is a long story, and it ends in blood." I sat on the worn-out sofa. I was ready. The debt explained the why, but Mrs. Higgins was about to give me the how. And I had a feeling that the explosion in my yard was just the final chapter of a book written in betrayal long ago. Mrs. Higgins placed a chipped mug of weak tea in front of me on the low coffee table. The steam rose up between us, a thin veil separating two parents who had been destroyed by the same man. She sat down opposite me, her hands clasping her own mug, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the earth. She took a deep breath, and when she looked up, her eyes were not angry. They were exhausted. It was the look of a woman who had run out of tears years ago. "You asked about Kyle." She began, her voice steady but quiet. "Kyle was not like Brandon. My boy was not flashy. He did not care about expensive cars or designer suits. He was a carpenter, Mr. Callahan. He worked with his hands just like you. He could look at a piece of wood and see the table it would become. He was gentle, and that was his problem. He trusted people. He trusted the wrong people." I leaned forward, listening intently. Every word felt like a brick being added to the wall of guilt crushing my chest. "They met 3 years ago," she continued. "Brandon came to Kyle with a proposal. He said he had a vision for a real estate flipping business. He said he had the investors and the business acumen, but he needed someone who knew construction, someone who could manage the renovations. He called it a partnership. He called Kyle his brother. My son came home that night with stars in his eyes. He told me that Brandon Callahan was going to change our lives. He said we would finally be able to fix the roof and pay off the medical bills I had from my surgery." She paused to take a sip of tea, her hand shaking so much the liquid rippled in the cup. For the first 6 months, it seemed real. "Kyle worked 18 hours a day. He renovated 2 houses almost single-handedly. But he never saw a dime. Brandon kept saying the money was tied up in equity. He said they needed to reinvest everything to grow. Kyle believed him. And then came the loan. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The loan. Brandon came to the house one night," she said, looking at the empty spot on the sofa, as if seeing a ghost. "He was frantic. He said the company was in a temporary cash flow crisis. He said they needed $50,000 immediately to secure a massive property downtown, or they would lose everything they had built. He told Kyle that because of his own credit score being tied up in other assets, he needed Kyle to sign for the bridge loan. He promised it was just for 30 days, she whispered. He promised on his mother's life. So Kyle signed. He signed papers that Brandon brought from a man sitting in a car with tinted windows. It was not a bank, Mr. Callahan. It was a shark. I closed my eyes. I knew what was coming. 2 weeks later, Brandon disappeared, she said, her voice hardening. He stopped answering calls. He stopped coming to the job site. And then the men started coming to our house. They did not want $50,000. With the predatory interest and the penalties hidden in the fine print, the debt ballooned overnight. They threw bricks through our windows. They followed me to the grocery store. They told Kyle that if he did not pay, they would burn this house down with me inside it. Kyle was terrified, she sobbed, the tears finally spilling over. He tried to find Brandon. He went to your house, did you know that? He went to your front gate, but Tiffany called the police. She told them a deranged stalker was harassing them. The police warned Kyle to stay away. He had nowhere to turn. He was 24 years old, Mr. Callahan. He was a boy. And he was drowning. She pointed a trembling finger at the ceiling. I came home from my shift at the diner 2 years ago on a Tuesday. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I found him in the garage. He had started the car and closed the door. He left a note on the dashboard. It said, "Mom, I am sorry. It is the only way to keep you safe. The debt dies with me." I sat there, unable to breathe. My son had not just stolen money. He had driven a young man to suicide to save his own skin. He had used his friend as a shield against the wolves he had invited in. "I am so sorry," I choked out. The words felt useless ash in my mouth. Mrs. Higgins wiped her face with her sleeve. "I did not tell you this to get your pity, Mr. Callahan. I told you because you need to know what kind of animal is living in your house. After the funeral, the debt collectors did stop coming. But I did not stop. I made a vow to my son. I vowed that Brandon would not get away with it. For 2 years I have been a ghost. I have followed him. I have watched him. I wanted to find proof of his illegal dealings so I could go to the FBI. This brings us to yesterday," I said, needing to connect the final pieces. "Yes," she nodded, composing herself. "Yesterday. I was at the Walmart parking lot because I had followed Brandon's car there. I saw him meet Tiffany. They did not go inside to shop. They sat in the car parked in the far corner near the recycling bins. I parked 2 rows away and crept up between the cars. I was hiding behind a shopping cart, returned close enough to hear them because Brandon had his window down to smoke." She leaned in, her eyes sharp and focused now. "I heard them arguing," she said. "Tiffany was screaming that they were out of time. She said the investors from Nevada were giving them 48 hours before they sent a cleaner. That is the word she used. Cleaner. She said, 'We have to cash out the policy now, Brandon. It is the only way.'" Mrs. Higgins took a breath. Then I heard Brandon. He sounded scared, but he agreed. He said, "The gas line is rigged. I set the timer for 2 a.m. The house will go up. It will look like a furnace malfunction. We will be in Aspen by the time the fire trucks arrive." My blood ran cold. Hearing it from her, a witness, made it undeniable. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated execution. Then Tiffany said something else. Mrs. Higgins continued. She said, "Make sure the old man does not go into the yard. If he sees the dig marks near the oak tree, he might get suspicious. We need him to stay inside and sleep." That is when I knew, Mr. Callahan. I knew they were killing you to pay off the debt that started with my son. When I saw you in the checkout line, and I saw your name on the ID, I saw the same confused, trusting look that Kyle used to have. I could not let him do it again. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "This is the license plate number of the man Brandon met afterwards to buy the fake passport," she said. "I have been documenting everything. But who listens to an old lady with no money? The police called Kyle's death a suicide. They called me a grieving mother looking for someone to blame." I reached out across the table and took her hand. Her skin was rough, calloused from years of hard work, just like mine. I squeezed it firmly. "They are going to listen now," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Because you are not alone anymore, Mrs. Higgins. You have a witness, and you have a partner." I looked at the shrine of Kyle on the mantel. "I made a silent promise to that boy I never met. 'My son took your life,' I whispered to the room. 'But he is not going to take mine, and he is not going to spend a single dime of that blood money.'" "Mrs. Higgins," I said, looking back at her. "Do you trust me?" She looked at me for a long moment, searching my face. Then slowly she nodded. "Yes, Mr. Callahan. I think I do." "Good," I said, standing up and pulling my coat tight. "Because tonight, Brandon and Tiffany are expecting a tragedy. They are expecting a helpless old man to die in his sleep, but they are making a mistake. They forgot that I am a foreman. And a foreman's job is to make sure that when things go wrong, the person responsible is the one who pays the price." I checked my watch. It was almost noon. The countdown was paused, but the clock on their freedom was ticking down fast. "Get your coat, Martha," I said, using her first name for the first time. We have to go to the police station, but not to file a report. We are going to see a friend of mine. We are going to set us a trap. And tonight when they come back to check the ashes, they are going to find something very different waiting for them." She stood up, and for the first time in years, I saw a spark of life in her eyes. It was not happiness. It was the cold, hard satisfaction of justice. "Let's go," she said. We walked out into the storm together. Two broken parents, one terrible secret, and a plan that was going to bring the whole house of cards crashing down on the people who built it. The snow was still falling, covering the world in white, but I no longer felt the cold. I was fueled by a fire that was burning hotter than any propane explosion. I was burning with the need to make things right. For Kyle, and for the father I used to be. The drive back from Martha Higgins' house was a blur of white snow and red rage. The blizzard had intensified, turning the Chicago streets into a frozen wasteland, which was fitting because that was exactly how I felt inside. Empty, cold, and dangerous. I pulled my truck into the garage and closed the door immediately. I did not want any prying eyes to see that I had returned. To the world, and specifically to my son, I was supposed to be inside the house, probably napping in my recliner, unknowingly counting down the minutes to my own cremation. I sat in the truck for a moment and dialed a number I had not called in years. It belonged to Harrison, my estate lawyer. He was a man of few words and expensive suits, but he was loyal to the dollar and loyal to the truth. Harrison said when he answered, "I need you to come to my house tonight, and I need you to bring the paperwork for the reverse mortgage we finalized last month. Yes, the hard copies. And bring a notary if you can find one brave enough to drive in this weather. This is not a consultation. This is an execution of will." He tried to argue about the weather, but something in my voice must have told him that this was a matter of life and death. He agreed to be there by midnight. Next, I called Jim Miller. Jim and I went to high school together. He was now the police chief of our precinct. We played poker on alternate Fridays, but tonight was not a game. "Jim," I said, keeping my voice low, "I have a situation at the house. I cannot give you details over the phone, but I need a squad car. No sirens, no lights. I need you to park 2 blocks down behind the old water tower. Do not come to the door until I text you the signal." Jim heard the steel in my tone. He did not ask questions. He just said he would be there himself. I entered my house, but I did not take off my coat. I felt like a stranger in my own living room. Every piece of furniture, every picture frame felt tainted by the presence of the people who wanted to burn it all down. I looked at the clock. It was 5 in the afternoon. I had 9 hours before the timer on the gas valve was set to trigger the release. But I had much less time to turn this house into a stage for their final performance. I went to my workshop in the basement. This was my sanctuary. It was where I kept my tools, my memories, and my surplus electronics. I grabbed a box of micro-surveillance cameras I had bought years ago to monitor a job site for theft. They were small wireless and had night vision. I moved through the house with the efficiency of a ghost. I placed the first camera in the bookshelf in the living room, wedged between a copy of Moby Dick and a structural engineering textbook. It had a perfect view of the front door and the main hallway. I placed the second camera in the kitchen, hidden atop the refrigerator. The third one went into the master bedroom right on the curtain rod, pointing directly at the bed where they expected to find my body. Then came the most dangerous part of the prep. I fetched a stepladder and went to every smoke detector in the house. There were 6 of them. I twisted them off their mounts and removed the 9-volt batteries. I did not want a stray beep or a sensitive sensor to alert them that the fire was not real. If they came back to check their handiwork, they would expect silence or the roar of flames. I would give them silence, but I would not leave them in the quiet for long. I went back to the basement and dug out 3 smart speakers I had received as a Christmas gift 2 years ago, but never unboxed, because I preferred the radio. I set them up in the ceiling vents, one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one right above the master bed. I wired them into the central home audio system and synced them to my phone. I tested the connection. Even from the basement, I could broadcast my voice into any room in the house. I could make the walls talk. As I turned the final screw to remove the battery from the hallway smoke detector, my hand trembled for the first time that night. Not from fear, but from the bitter irony of it all. I installed these devices 20 years ago to protect my family from fire. I taught Brandon how to check the batteries every 6 months. Safety first, son, I used to tell him. And now here I was, disabling the very safety system of this house to trap him. I walked through the living room, running my hand over the marble mantelpiece. I remembered Christmas Eves, the laughter, the stockings hung right here. All of that is just ash now. This house isn't a home anymore. It's a battlefield. And I, the builder who poured sweat to raise it, now have to turn it into a steel cage to hold the monsters I once called family. By the time I finished, it was nearly midnight. Harrison arrived through the back door, shaking snow off his coat, looking bewildered. Jim arrived 10 minutes later, parking his cruiser down the street as promised and walking through the snow to my back gate. I ushered them into the basement. I did not offer them coffee. I offered them the truth. I showed them the footage from the camera I had temporarily set up near the oak tree. I showed them the dug-up pipe. I played the recording Mrs. Higgins had made on her phone of Brandon and Tiffany in the parking lot. Jim's face went pale. Harrison looked like he was about to be sick. They watched the evidence in silence. When it was over, Jim reached for his radio to call for backup to arrest them on the highway. No, I stopped him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Not yet. Attempted murder is hard to prove if nothing happens. They will say they didn't know. They will blame a contractor. I need them to commit. I need them to come here expecting a body, and I need them to confess when they think no one is listening. We waited. The three of us sat in the basement, surrounded by the glow of the monitors. I had set up a command center on my workbench. One screen showed the interior of the house. Another showed the exterior perimeter. And the third showed the GPS tracker I had installed on Brandon's car months ago when he borrowed it. The hours ticked by. 1 a.m. 1:30 a.m. The house above us was dark and silent. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, providing the perfect soundtrack for a horror movie. At 1:55 in the morning, 5 minutes before the gas was supposed to release, the GPS dot on the screen stopped moving. They were not in Aspen. They were not even on the highway. I zoomed in on the map. The dot was pulsing steadily. They were parked on an old logging road at the edge of the forest preserve, less than a mile from the house. It was a vantage point. From there, through the bare winter trees, they would have a clear line of sight to my roof. I watched the screen, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I could imagine them in that car. Brandon in the driver's seat, sweating, gripping the wheel. Tiffany in the passenger seat, checking her watch, her eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the orange glow of an explosion to light up the night sky. They had turned off their headlights. They were sitting in the dark, freezing, waiting for their inheritance to go up in smoke. I leaned into the microphone on my desk, my finger hovering over the button that would broadcast to the speakers upstairs. But I did not press it yet. "Let them wait," I whispered to the monitor. "Let them watch the clock." I looked at Jim and Harrison. They were tense, their eyes glued to the screens. "It is almost time," I said. At 2 a.m. the valve opens. At 3 a.m. the spark hits. They will give it until 3:15. When they don't see a fire, they will panic. They will come to finish the job themselves. I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking in the silence of the basement. I was not a father anymore. I was a hunter sitting in a blind, and the wolves were circling just outside the firelight. 2 minutes to 2. I stared at the image of my empty bedroom on the screen. The bed was made. The pillow was fluffed. It looked so inviting. "Come on home, son," I thought. "Come and see what you have built." 2 in the morning came and went with the silence of a tomb. Down in the basement, the three of us sat motionless, our eyes fixed on the bank of monitors. Above our heads in the master bedroom, the digital timer I had rewired clicked over. The solenoid valve opened. But instead of the hiss of deadly propane rushing into the vents, there was only the sound of the wind rattling the gutters outside. I imagined what was supposed to be happening right now according to their plan. The gas should have been pooling on the floor, an invisible lake of death rising inch by inch, filling the room where they thought I was sleeping. It was a sickening thought, visualizing my own lungs filling with poison while my son drove away to a ski resort. Harrison, my lawyer, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, despite the chill in the basement. He looked at his watch, then at me. "Nothing is happening, Lucas," he whispered, as if speaking too loud would trigger the explosion himself. "Wait," I said, my voice barely a rumble in my chest. "The show isn't over. The gas is the setup. The spark is the punchline." We waited another hour. It was the longest hour of my life. Every minute that ticked by was a minute my son could have turned the car around. He could have had a change of heart. He could have remembered the time I taught him to fish, or the time I paid off his first car. He could have rushed back to save me. I found myself praying for that. "Please, Brandon, turn around. Burst through the door and warn me. Be the man I raised you to be." But the GPS dot on the screen did not move. It stayed parked on that logging road, watching, waiting. At 3 in the morning, the second timer would have triggered the spark. Up in the bedroom, a tiny electrical current pulsed through the wire I had cut. In their version of reality, this was the moment the house would disintegrate. This was the moment the roof would lift off, and the walls would blow out, turning 40 years of memories into a crater. 301, 305. The house stood firm. The cameras showed only the peaceful, dark interior of a home surviving a blizzard. On the perimeter monitor, however, the stillness was breaking. The long-range night vision camera I had pointed toward the woods picked up movement. The SUV, which had been a dark, hulking shape against the trees, suddenly rocked violently on its suspension. I leaned in closer to the screen. The image was grainy black and green, but I knew what I was seeing. The interior dome light flickered on a beacon in the darkness. It was a mistake. Light discipline is the first thing you learn in the field, but they were not soldiers. They were desperate amateurs. Through the windshield, I saw them. Tiffany was screaming. I couldn't hear her, but I could see the contortion of her face, the veins bulging in her neck. She was gesturing wildly toward the house, then back at Brandon. She was furious. The explosion hadn't happened. The payoff was delayed. Brandon looked small in the driver's seat. He was slumped over his head in his hands. He looked like a man who was ready to vomit. He was shaking his head, perhaps trying to argue that they should just leave, that the plan had failed. But Tiffany was not a woman who accepted failure. On the screen, I saw her hand fly out. She struck him. It wasn't a playful slap. It was a vicious, backhanded blow across the face. Brandon's head snapped back against the headrest. She grabbed him by the collar of his jacket and shook him, screaming something right into his face. "She is losing control, Jim," the police chief murmured next to me. He had his hand on his holster, his eyes narrowing. "Watch," I said. "She isn't done." Tiffany shoved Brandon away and threw open the passenger door. She stomped out into the snow, marching around to the back of the SUV. She didn't look like a real estate agent anymore. In the ghostly green light of the camera, she looked like a predator. She hit the trunk release. She reached inside and pulled out something heavy. My stomach dropped. It was a red gasoline canister, the 5-gallon kind I used for the lawnmower. And then she pulled out another one. She slammed the trunk and walked around to the driver's side. She yanked the door open and dragged Brandon out by his arm. He stumbled into the snow, falling to his knees. She didn't help him up. She kicked snow at him. She reached back into the car and pulled out a long arc object. A crowbar. She shoved one of the gas cans into Brandon's chest. He wrapped his arms around it like a lifeline. She grabbed the other one herself, gripping the crowbar in her other hand. She pointed the metal bar at the house, then at him. It was a command. Plan B, I said, my voice cold. The gas didn't work. The spark didn't catch. So now they are going to do it the old-fashioned way. They are going to break in, pour gasoline on the carpets, and light a match. They are going to make it look like a robbery gone wrong that ended in a fire. Jim stood up his chair, scraping against the concrete floor. That is it, Lucas. I am calling it in. We have them on conspiracy. We have them on possession of burglary tools. I can have my boys intercept them before they cross the property line. He reached for his radio. I put my hand over his. My grip was hard, the grip of a man who has held jackhammers for a living. No, I said. Jim looked at me, shocked. Lucas, are you crazy? They are coming to burn your house down with you inside it. They are armed. If you arrest them now, I said, looking him dead in the eye. What do you have, trespassing possession of gasoline? A good lawyer will plead that down to a misdemeanor. They will say they ran out of gas. They will say they were coming to check on me. They will walk away with a slap on the wrist. I looked back at the screen. I saw my son standing up in the snow, wiping blood from his lip, holding the can of fuel that was meant to incinerate me. I need them to commit Jim. I need them to break that glass. I need them to pour that gasoline. I need them to strike the lighter. But Lucas Harrison interjected, his voice trembling. That is too dangerous. If the fire catches, I built this house, I snapped. I know how long it takes to burn. I have fire extinguishers in every room. I have you two in the basement. I pulled out my phone and typed a text message to the tactical team Jim had stationed down the street. I showed the screen to Jim before I hit send. The message read, "Hold your position. Do not engage until I give the signal. I need a charge of attempted murder in the first degree. I do not want them for breaking and entering. I want them for trying to burn a man alive." Jim stared at the phone, then at me. He saw the resolve in my face. He saw that this wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about a father needing to know with absolute certainty that there was nothing left of his son to save. He slowly nodded and sat back down. Okay, Lucas. It is your call. But the second I see a flame, we are moving in. I nodded and turned back to the monitor. They were moving now. Two dark figures trudging through the deep snow, cutting through the woods to approach the house from the rear. They were avoiding the driveway, avoiding the streetlights. They were hunting. I watched Brandon. He was lagging behind Tiffany. He was stumbling. Part of me, the foolish, sentimental part, hoped he would drop the can. Hoped he would run away. But he didn't. He kept walking. He followed her commands. He followed her into the dark. I leaned back in the darkness of the basement. The silence was gone. Now I could hear the phantom sound of their footsteps in the snow. "Come on," I whispered. "Come and finish what you started. Do not stop now. If you want my life, you are going to have to look me in the eye when you take it." The trap was set. The bait was waiting. All they had to do was walk into the cage. The silence in the basement was shattered not by a noise we heard directly, but by the audio feed coming through the monitors. It started with a dull thud against the back of the house, followed instantly by the sharp, jagged crash of glass breaking. On the screen, labeled Kitchen, I saw the window above the sink explode inward. Shards of glass sprayed across the countertops, where my late wife used to roll out cookie dough. A gust of snow blew in, swirling into the warm air of the house, followed by a gloved hand reaching in to unlock the latch. Jim stiffened in his chair, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm, but I held up a finger. Not yet. We watched as the window sash was shoved up. A leg swung over the sill. It was Brandon. He landed clumsily on the tiled floor, slipping slightly on the melting snow and broken glass. He was wearing all black, a ski mask pulled down over his face, but I knew his walk. I knew the way he held his shoulders hunched tight with anxiety. He scanned the room, sweeping a flashlight beam across the appliances, breathing hard. The vapor of his breath puffed out through the mouth hole of the mask. Then came Tiffany. She didn't climb in with hesitation. She vaulted through the window with a terrifying efficiency. She was also masked, but her movements were sharp, aggressive. In her hand, she gripped the red gasoline canister tight. She shoved Brandon forward, pointing toward the living room. Even through the grainy black and white footage, the dynamic was clear. She was the general. He was the foot soldier. They moved out of the kitchen and into the main hallway. The house was pitch black save for the erratic beams of their flashlights cutting through the dark. I watched them step onto the hardwood floors I had sanded and stained myself 20 years ago. Tiffany uncapped the gas can. She didn't just pour it. She sloshed it. She walked backwards, swinging the heavy can in wide arcs, coating the expensive Persian rug in the living room, splashing it onto the velvet curtains, dousing the antique armchairs. The liquid looked black on the camera screen. I could almost smell the fumes from where I sat. That acrid chemical sting of gasoline. It is a smell that usually means work lawnmowers and engines. Tonight, it meant erasure. They were soaking the heart of my home in accelerant. They were turning my sanctuary into a tinderbox. Brandon stood frozen by the staircase, holding the second can, looking around as if waiting for a ghost to jump out. Tiffany marched back to him, grabbed his shoulder, and pointed at the floor. She mimed pouring. She was telling him to soak the base of the stairs. If the fire started there, no one on the second floor would be able to run down. It was a tactical decision. It was a decision to ensure there were no survivors. Brandon uncapped his can. His hands were shaking so bad he spilled fuel on his own boots. He started to pour, backing up toward the foyer. The glug, glug, glug sound, amplified by the sensitive microphones I had installed, was rhythmic and sickening. It sounded like a heartbeat. A toxic, flammable heartbeat. As they moved towards the stairs, the camera angle shifted to the view from the bookshelf. This was the moment that broke me. As Brandon turned to head up the stairs, his flashlight beam swept across the wall. The light caught the reflection of a large framed photograph hanging at the foot of the staircase. He stopped. The beam of light held steady on the image. I looked at the monitor. I knew that picture. It was taken the day Brandon graduated from college. I was standing next to him, my arm around his shoulder, beaming with a pride so bright it felt like it could light up the world. He was wearing his cap and gown, holding his diploma, smiling that wide, infectious smile that used to make me believe everything would be okay. On the screen, Brandon lowered the gas can. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the glass of the frame. He stood there for a second, just 1 second, paralyzed by the image of the father who had paid for that degree, the father who had cheered the loudest in the stadium. For a heartbeat, I saw a boy. I saw my son. I saw hesitation. But then Tiffany realized he had stopped. She spun around. She saw what he was looking at. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at the photo with regret. She stepped forward, raised the crowbar she was carrying in her left hand, and swung it with all her strength. Smash! The sound was deafening. The glass shattered. The frame splintered. The picture of us fell to the floor in a heap of ruin. She didn't stop there. She stomped on it. She ground her heel into the faces in the photo, twisting her foot to make sure the glass pulverized the paper underneath. She shoved Brandon hard against the wall, pointing up the stairs, her body language screaming at him to move. In the basement, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. It was a long, shuddering exhale. Beside me, Harrison looked away, unable to watch the cruelty. Jim stared at the screen, his jaw set in stone. That was the moment. That was the death. Up until that second, a tiny, foolish part of me had hoped. Maybe he would stop. Maybe he would remember. But when she smashed that photo, and when he didn't shove her back, when he simply picked up his gas can and nodded, the Lucas Callahan, who was a father, died. The man sitting in the basement chair was no longer a parent. I was a witness. I was a judge. And I was the executioner of their fate. The pain in my chest vanished. It was replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. They were not family. They were intruders. They were arsonists. They were murderers in training. And they were walking up the stairs of my house to kill a man they thought was sleeping. They reached the landing of the second floor. They moved slower now, creeping like thieves. They approached the door of the master bedroom, my bedroom, the place where I was supposed to be lying in bed, vulnerable and unaware. Tiffany signaled for Brandon to stop. She pointed to the bottom of the door. She wanted him to pour the gasoline right there, forming a puddle against the threshold. When they lit it, the fire would block the door instantly. If the gas explosion hadn't killed me, this wall of fire would trap me inside to burn to death. They tipped the cans. The fuel pooled dark and slick on the hardwood of the hallway. They were sealing the tomb. They backed away slowly, trailing a line of gasoline down the hall, creating a fuse that would lead them to safety while I screamed in the flames. I leaned forward toward the microphone. My finger hovered over the button. They thought they were the hunters. They thought they were in control, but they were standing exactly where I wanted them. They were standing in the center of the trap, and the door to the cage was about to slam shut. I looked at Jim. He nodded. He drew his weapon. "It is time," I whispered. I pressed the button. I watched the monitor with the cold detachment of a surgeon about to make the final incision. On the screen, Brandon raised his heavy boot. He was shaking, terrified, but propelled by the screaming woman behind him. He kicked the door of my bedroom. The wood around the lock splintered with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent house. The door swung open violently, banging against the interior wall. Brandon stumbled into the room, the red gas can sloshing in his hands, ready to douse the sleeping form of his father. Tiffany was right on his heels, the crowbar raised high, her face twisted into a mask of murderous anticipation. They expected to find an old man confused by the noise, groggy from sleep, easy prey for their fire. They expected to pour the fuel, strike a match, and run. But the room was empty. The bed was not just empty. It was made. I had made it myself before I went down to the basement. The sheets were pulled tight, military style. The pillows were fluffed and arranged with precision. There was no indentation of a body. There was no smell of an old man. It was pristine. It was a statement. It shouted that I was not a victim. I was prepared. Brandon froze. He stood in the center of the room, the gas can hanging limp in his hand, dripping fuel onto the carpet I had installed the year he was born. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the corners, checking the bathroom, checking the closet. Nothing. No one. Tiffany pushed past him, her breathing ragged and loud on the audio feed. "Where is he?" she hissed. "He has to be here. His truck is in the garage." She ripped the blankets off the bed, throwing them onto the floor in a rage as if I were hiding underneath the mattress like a child. That was when she saw it. Resting perfectly in the center of the bare mattress, right where my head should have been, was a single sheet of white printer paper. Tiffany snatched it up. Brandon leaned in his flashlight beam, trembling over the text. I zoomed the camera in. I knew exactly what it said. I had printed it in bold black letters. Insurance code 0. I saw the color drain from Brandon's face. He understood instantly. He knew the terminology. 0 meant void. 0 meant canceled. 0 meant that the pot of gold at the end of their rainbow of violence was empty. Tiffany stared at the paper, her eyes darting back and forth, as if trying to decode a hidden message. "What does this mean?" she screamed at Brandon. "What does 0 mean?" Before he could answer, I made my move. I hit the master kill switch on the control panel in front of me. Thunk! The power to the entire house cut out. The hallway lights died. The porch lights died. The house was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The only light came from the frantic jerking beams of their flashlights cutting through the gloom like lightsabers in a hopeless battle. Then I hit the second switch. The bedroom door, which had been standing open, swung shut. It was a heavy, solid oak door that I had reinforced years ago. It didn't just latch. It slammed with the force of a hammer. And then came the sound that sealed their fate. The magnetic lock I had installed for home security engaged. Click. It was a low, powerful hum. That magnet could withstand 2,000 pounds of force. They were trapped. They were locked in the very room they had intended to turn into an incinerator. And they were trapped in there with the fumes of the gasoline they had spilled. Tiffany threw herself at the door. She grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't budge a millimeter. She pounded on the wood with her fist. "Open it!" she screamed. "Brandon, help me! Open this damn door!" Brandon didn't move. He was standing in the middle of the room, staring at the darkness. I leaned into the microphone. I adjusted the volume on the smart speaker mounted in the ceiling directly above their heads. I wanted my voice to fill the room. I wanted it to sound like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Hello, children," I said. My voice boomed through the room, magnified and crisp. On the screen, I saw them both jump. Tiffany spun around, aiming her flashlight at the ceiling, looking for the source. Brandon dropped the gas can. It hit the floor with a hollow thud. "Are you looking for Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, almost conversational. "Or are you looking for the $2 million? Tiffany screamed at the ceiling. "Where are you, you old bat? Let us out of here!" I ignored her. I focused on my son. "You brought a lot of gasoline, Brandon," I said. "That is dangerous stuff, especially in a room with no ventilation. You know, I found the pipe in the yard. I found the timer. I found the wires. I watched Brandon fall to his knees. It wasn't a slow descent. His legs simply stopped working. He collapsed onto the gasoline-soaked rug, his hands covering his face. I disconnected it," I continued. "I wouldn't want you to blow up the house before you heard the news." Tiffany was slamming the crowbar against the door now, chipping the wood, but the steel core held firm. She was like a wild animal caught in a snare, thrashing, biting, refusing to accept that she had been outsmarted. "Stop hitting my door, Tiffany," I commanded. My voice echoed with authority. "You are not going anywhere, and neither is the money." She stopped, chest heaving, looking up at the ceiling. "What did you do?" she snarled. "I did what any good father would do," I said. "I protected my investment. You see that paper on the bed is the truth. There is no insurance money, not for you. And the house, you are standing in a house that belongs to the bank. I signed the reverse mortgage papers last month. The money went to a charity." The silence that followed was heavy, heavier than the darkness. "A charity," Tiffany whispered, the fight draining out of her. "Yes," I said. "A charity for victims of predatory lending, in memory of a boy named Kyle Higgins." At the mention of Kyle's name, Brandon let out a sound that was half sob, half wail. He curled into a ball on the floor. He knew. He knew that I knew everything. "Dad, please," Brandon choked out, speaking to the empty air. "I didn't want to. She made me. Please, Dad. It smells like gas in here. I can't breathe." "You can't breathe," I repeated, letting the anger finally seep into my voice. "You were going to pump this room full of propane while I slept. You were going to burn me alive, Brandon. You were going to turn my bones into ash so you could pay off your gambling debts. And now you want me to open the door because it smells a little bad." I leaned back in my chair in the basement. I looked at Jim and Harrison. Jim had his gun drawn, but he was watching the screen with a look of awe. He had never seen justice served quite like this. I pressed the button again. "I am not going to open the door, son," I said softly. "But don't worry. You won't be in there alone for long. I have invited some friends over to meet you. Sirens. I had texted the signal to the patrol cars down the street the moment the door locked. Now I could hear them. The wail of the sirens cut through the storm, getting louder and louder. Blue and red lights began to flash against the bedroom window, illuminating the room in a strobe light of consequences. Tiffany ran to the window. She looked down. The driveway was filling with police cars. "No," she screamed. "No, no, no." She turned back to Brandon. "Get up," she kicked him. "Get up, you coward. We have to break the window. We have to jump." She raised the crowbar to smash the glass. "Don't do it, Tiffany," I warned over the speaker. "There are 5 officers pointing guns at that window right now. If you break that glass, they might think you are shooting. And I would hate for you to get hurt before you stand trial." She froze. The crowbar lowered. She looked at the door. She looked at the window. She looked at her husband curled on the floor. She realized it was over. I watched her drop the crowbar. It clattered to the floor next to the gas can. She slid down the wall, sitting amidst the wreckage of her plan. I sat in the dark basement watching the 2 people who had plotted my death. They were crying now. But they weren't crying for me. They weren't crying for the betrayal. They were crying for themselves. They were crying because they got caught. I looked at the image of my son one last time. The boy I raised. The man who tried to kill me. "Welcome home, kids," I whispered. "I hope you like your new room. You are going to be in a cell just like it for a very long time." I turned off the microphone. I stood up. I nodded to Jim. "Go get them," I said. Jim patted my shoulder as he ran up the stairs to let his team in. Harrison just sat there shaking his head. "You are a hard man, Lucas," he said quietly. I looked at the monitors, at the blue lights flashing on the faces of the monsters in my bedroom. "I am a builder, Harrison," I said. "And sometimes you have to demolish a structure that is too rotten to save." I turned off the screens. The show was over. The cleanup was about to begin. I picked up the stack of papers from the desk in front of me. The microphone was cold against my lips, but the fire in my chest was still burning hot. Through the monitor, I could see them frozen in that room, bathed in the blue and red strobes of the police lights outside, waiting for my next words. They looked like statues of guilt. I wanted them to hear every single detail of why they were sitting there. I wanted to strip away every layer of their justification until there was nothing left but their greed. "Brandon," I said, my voice filling the bedroom speakers with a crystal-clear resonance. "I am holding a letter here from the Silver Sands Casino in Nevada. It is dated 3 weeks ago. It says you owe them $850,000. It says that if you do not pay by the 1st of the month, they are going to send contractors to collect. Contractors who do not use briefcases." On the screen, Brandon flinched as if I had whipped him. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing into the gasoline-soaked carpet. I continued flipping the page. "And here is a series of text messages, Brandon. But these aren't yours. These are from Tiffany's phone. I accessed her cloud account while you 2 were busy digging trenches in my yard." Tiffany looked up at the ceiling, her eyes wide with panic. She shook her head, mouthing the word "no," but I did not stop. "You might want to listen to this, son," I said. "It seems Tiffany has been very busy. Here is a message to a man named David. He is a lawyer, isn't he? It says, and I quote, 'Don't worry, baby. The old man will be gone by Tuesday. Brandon is too weak to do it himself, but I will make sure he lights the match. Once we get the insurance money, I will divorce the loser, and we can finally buy that condo in Miami.'" I watched Brandon. He slowly lifted his head. He looked at his wife, the woman who had handed him a crowbar, the woman who had told him to kill his father. And now he realized she had been planning to leave him the moment the check cleared. The betrayal on his face was absolute. He looked like a man who had just realized he had sold his soul for a counterfeit coin. I am not done, I said, my voice hardening. Let's talk about the snow. You thought you were so clever with your weather reports and your warnings about slippery ice. But I have the invoice here for the PVC pipe Tiffany bought at the hardware store on 5th Street last Monday, and the irrigation timer. You bought that online using my credit card number. You tried to make me pay for the very device that was supposed to kill me. That is a special kind of evil. But that isn't even the sickest part, Tiffany. I want you to reach into Brandon's left jacket pocket, right now. On the screen, Brandon looked confused as he patted his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. That is a receipt I found in the trash can of your car. My voice boomed through the speakers. Read it out loud, Brandon. Does that say a $300 bottle of Dom Perignon, time-stamped 4:00 p.m. yesterday? You bought celebration drinks. You bought champagne to toast to my death before I was even dead. Brandon stared at the receipt, then at Tiffany like she was a demon. He had bought it on her orders. She planned to pop that cork on the drive to Aspen the moment their phones alerted them the house had blown. You were going to toast on my ashes, I roared. You were going to drink my blood in the form of expensive wine. That level of evil isn't human. That is why I feel absolutely no remorse watching you shiver in that room. Drink it up, Brandon. Swallow the bitter taste of failure. I paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle in the room. The sirens outside were deafening now, a chorus of judgment, but inside the room, the only sound was Brandon's ragged breathing. You treated me like a senile old fool, I said. You thought I was just a checkbook with a pulse. You thought you could manipulate me, gaslight me, and then extinguish me like a candle. But you made one fatal miscalculation. You assumed that because I am old, I am blind. But I see everything. I leaned closer to the microphone for the final blow. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the payoff that would hurt them more than prison. You are crying about the money, I said softly. You are terrified of the loan sharks in Nevada. You are thinking that even if you go to jail, at least the house is still here. At least there is an asset. At least there is an inheritance waiting for you in 20 years. I let out a short, dry laugh. You really should have read the mail on the kitchen counter, I said. If you had, you would have seen the letter from the bank. You see, children, last month I finalized a reverse mortgage on this property. Tiffany's jaw dropped. She knew what those words meant. She worked in real estate. She knew exactly what I had done. That is right, I said. I sold the equity of this house to the bank in exchange for a lump sum payment. I cashed out Tiffany. Every single brick, every wooden beam, every inch of this land now belongs to the First National Bank of Chicago. And the money. The $1.2 million that you thought you were going to steal, I picked up the receipt from the transfer I had made just 2 days ago. It is gone, I said. I donated every single penny of it yesterday morning. I set up an irrevocable trust. The Kyle Higgins Foundation for Victims of Financial Fraud. I saw Brandon's body convulse. The name Kyle Higgins hung in the air like smoke. So here is the reality. I said, my voice echoing like a gavel. You are not standing in your inheritance. You are standing in the bank's property, and you just poured 5 gallons of gasoline on it. You smashed the windows. You destroyed the floors. If you had lit that match, you wouldn't just be murderers. You would be destroying federal property. You owe the bank $1.2 million for the damage you have already caused. You are not just broke, Brandon. You are destitute. You have nothing. No house, no insurance, no wife, and no father. The effect of my words was immediate and catastrophic. Tiffany slumped against the door, her legs giving out completely. She slid down until she hit the floor, her expensive coat soaking up the gasoline she had spilled. She stared at the wall, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The calculation in her eyes was gone, replaced by the hollow 1,000-yard stare of total ruin. She realized that all her scheming, all her manipulation, all her cruelty had resulted in absolutely nothing. She had played a high-stakes game and lost every single chip. Brandon didn't move. He just stared at the gasoline can next to him. The realization of the double cross hit him. He had tried to kill his father for a woman who was cheating on him for money that didn't exist to pay a debt that would now get him killed in prison. He looked at Tiffany with a mixture of hatred and disgust, but he didn't have the strength to attack her. He was broken. They sat there in the dark, trapped in the fumes of their own failure. They were locked in a box of their own making. The money was gone. The house was gone. Their freedom was gone. And the most painful part was knowing that the old man they mocked, the father they underestimated, was the one who had outsmarted them at every turn. I watched them for a few more seconds. I felt no joy. I felt no triumph. I just felt a deep, heavy exhaustion. It was done. The lesson was taught. The price was paid. I keyed the microphone one last time. "The police are coming up the stairs now," I said quietly. "Don't make any sudden moves." And Brandon. "When you get to prison, try to find a job in the library. It is safer than the yard, and you are going to need something to read for the next 25 years. I released the button and sat back in the silence of the basement. The heavy footsteps of the tactical team pounded on the floorboards above my head. I heard the shouting. I heard the commands to get on the ground. I heard the click of handcuffs, but it all sounded far away. I looked at the blank screen where my family used to be, and I finally let myself close my eyes. The magnetic lock on the bedroom door disengaged with a heavy mechanical clack that sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. For a split second, Brandon and Tiffany looked at each other with a glimmer of hope, thinking perhaps the system had failed, or I had shown mercy. They scrambled toward the door, their hands reaching for the freedom they thought lay on the other side. But as the door swung open, it was not the quiet darkness of the hallway that greeted them. It was a wall of blinding white light. The tactical team had breached the front entrance and moved up the stairs with silent precision, and now they filled the frame of the door. Heavy combat boots stomped onto the hardwood floor, shaking the very foundation of the house. Shield lights blinded the couple, forcing them to shield their eyes. The chaotic shouting of the officers filled the small room, bouncing off the walls. "Get on the ground. Hands where I can see them. Do not move." The commands were overlapping loud and leaving no room for negotiation. I watched on the monitor as Tiffany tried to back away, retreating toward the window, but the glass was lit up from the outside by the high beams of the patrol cars in the driveway. She was trapped in a box of light. There was nowhere to run. A loudspeaker from the street cut through the noise inside the house, booming with a distorted metallic authority. "Brandon and Tiffany Callahan, this is the police. Drop any weapons and surrender immediately. The house is surrounded. I saw the fight leave Tiffany's body. She did not drop to her knees in surrender. She simply collapsed under the weight of her own failure." 2 officers moved in swiftly, grabbing her arms and pulling them behind her back. I heard the distinct ratcheting sound of handcuffs tightening. She did not scream. She did not curse. She was limp, a rag doll of a woman who had realized her life was over. Brandon was already face down on the carpet, sobbing into the gasoline-soaked fibers. He offered no resistance as a large officer hauled him up and shoved him against the wall to frisk him. The gas can he had held was kicked aside, rolling across the floor as a piece of evidence that would seal his fate. Down in the basement, I stood up from my chair. I turned off the monitors. The show was over, and now it was time for the curtain call. I did not rush. I walked over to the corner of the room where I had hung my garment bag earlier that evening. I took off my dusty work jacket, the one I had worn to dig up the pipes and lay the trap. I hung it up for the last time. Underneath, I was wearing a crisp white shirt. I took my dark navy suit jacket from the hanger and slipped it on, smoothing out the lapels. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of the blank monitor screen. I was not going upstairs as a victim. I was not going upstairs as a confused old man in his pajamas. I was going upstairs as a man of dignity. I was dressing for a funeral. Not my own, but the funeral of the relationship with my son. I walked up the basement stairs, listening to the commotion above. The house smelled strongly of gasoline and melted snow, a toxic mix that burned the nose. I stepped into the kitchen, broken glass crunching under my dress shoes. The cold wind blew through the shattered window, but I did not feel it. I walked into the living room. It was crowded with uniforms. The police chief, Jim, saw me and nodded a silent gesture of respect. He motioned for his men to clear a path. They were leading Brandon and Tiffany toward the front door. They were shuffling awkwardly, their ankles shackled, their heads bowed. When Brandon saw me standing there by the fireplace, looking untouched and resolute, he stopped. He dug his heels into the rug, fighting against the officer's grip. His face was a mess of tears and snot, his eyes wild with panic. He looked at my suit. He looked at my calm expression, and he broke. "Dad," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Dad, please tell them. Tell them it was a mistake." He lunged toward me, but the officers held him back. "It was her, Dad," he wailed, pointing his chin toward Tiffany, who was being led out ahead of him. "She made me do it. She said we had to. She said you were sick and it would be a mercy. I didn't want to hurt you, Dad. I swear. I was scared. She threatened to leave me. Please, Dad, you can't let them take me to prison. I am your son." He was blubbering now, begging like a child who had been caught stealing candy, not a man who had been caught with a gas can and a lighter. He wanted me to save him. He wanted the father he had tried to murder to step in and fix it, just like I had fixed his bicycle and paid his tuition. He wanted the safety net he had tried to set on fire. I stepped forward, slowly closing the distance between us. The room went quiet. Even the police officers seemed to hold their breath. I stopped just inches from him. I looked him up and down. I looked at the hands that had held the gas can. I looked at the eyes that had watched the clock waiting for me to die. I did not see my son. I saw a stranger, a dangerous, weak stranger. I stood tall, my posture rigid, my voice steady and low, so that he had to lean in to hear me. I looked straight into his watery, shifting eyes, and I let the silence hang for a moment longer, letting the weight of his betrayal crush the air between us. "I do not have a son named Brandon," I said, my words cutting through the room like a cold wind. Brandon flinched, as if I had struck him. "Dad." "What are you saying?" he whispered. "My son was a good man," I continued, my voice devoid of any warmth. "My son had honor. My son loved me. That boy died today. He died the moment he decided to pick up a shovel and dig a grave for his father in the snow." I leaned in closer, my eyes locking onto his. "You are not my son," I said. "You are just a man who broke into my house. You are a bad investment that I have finally written off." I straightened up and looked at the officers holding him. "Get him out of my house," I said, turning my back on him. Brandon screamed. It was a primal sound of total loss. He screamed for me to look at him, but I did not turn around. I walked toward the window and watched the snow falling outside. I heard the front door open and close. I heard the heavy footsteps fade away. I heard the squad car doors slam shut. Only then did I let out a breath. I adjusted my cuffs. I looked at the empty room, at the ruined rug, at the broken picture frame on the floor. It was all gone. But as I stood there in the silence, I realized something. The house was empty, but for the first time in months, so was the heavy burden on my heart. I was alone, but I was safe. And I was free. 6 months later, I sat in the back row of the county courthouse. The room was sterile and smelled of floor wax and old paper. It was a far cry from the chaotic, gasoline-soaked nightmare of my bedroom, but the tension was just as thick. I watched the backs of their heads. Brandon had lost weight. His suit, provided by a public defender, hung loosely on his frame. Tiffany had lost her arrogance. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, And without her expensive makeup and designer clothes, she looked plain. She looked like exactly what she was, a criminal. The trial had been short. The evidence I provided, the audio recordings, the video footage, the rigged gas timer, the text messages, was overwhelming. There was no plea deal. The district attorney wanted to make an example of them, and I did not stand in his way. When the judge asked the defendants if they had anything to say, Tiffany remained silent, staring at the table. Brandon tried to turn around. He tried to find me in the gallery, but I was looking at the seal of the state on the wall behind the judge. I was done listening to his apologies. The gavel came down with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. The judge sentenced them both to 25 years in a federal penitentiary for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted arson, and insurance fraud. 25 years. They would be eligible for parole in 15, but by then the world would have moved on without them. I watched the bailiffs pull them to their feet. I heard the clinking of the chains. As they were led out the side door, Brandon looked back one last time. He didn't scream for me to save him. He just looked at me with a hollow, haunted expression. He finally realized that the bank was closed, the father was gone, and he was on his own. I walked out of the courthouse into the spring sunshine. I took a deep breath. The air tasted sweet. It tasted like justice. I got into my truck, but I didn't drive back to the log cabin. I had sold the land to a developer a week after the arrest. I couldn't live there anymore. Too many ghosts, too many memories of a little boy who grew up to be a monster. I took the money from the sale of the land, added it to my pension, and I started driving south. I didn't stop until I ran out of road. Now the only white stuff I see is the foam on the waves crashing against the shore. I am sitting on the patio of a small sun-drenched condo in the Florida Keys. The air smells of salt water and charcoal. I am grilling steaks, thick ribeyes, just the way I like them. I am not alone. Sitting at the patio table pouring 2 glasses of iced tea is Martha Higgins. We are not lovers. We are too old and too tired for romance. We are something stronger. We are survivors. We are 2 parents who lost our sons to greed, and we found solace in each other's company. We are friends who understand the silence. We pool our resources. We share the grocery bills. We take walks on the beach in the mornings and watch the tourists in the evenings. We are spending the money I worked 40 years to earn, and we are enjoying every single penny of it. Martha looks up and smiles as I bring the platter of meat to the table. She looks 10 years younger than the terrified woman I met in Walmart. Her laugh is genuine now. We talk about Kyle often. We toast to his memory. We talk about the foundation I started in his name, which has already helped 3 families save their homes from predatory lenders. We are turning our tragedy into a shield for others. I look out at the ocean, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. It is beautiful. It is peaceful. It is everything I deserve. I sip my tea and turn to look at you, the listener. I want you to really hear me. Sometimes God sends you a stranger to save your life because the people you share blood with are too busy digging your grave. That woman in the store could have walked away. She could have minded her own business, but she didn't. She listened to her conscience, and I listened to her. That is the key. Don't ever ignore your intuition. Don't ever ignore that little voice in the back of your head that says something is wrong, even if the person telling you everything is fine is your own child. Trust actions, not words. Trust the vibration in the floorboards, not the smile on the face. And remember this: snow is beautiful. It is pure and white and covers everything in a blanket of innocence. But don't ever touch it if you don't know what lies beneath, because sometimes under that pristine surface there is a trap waiting to blow your world apart. I survived the winter, and now I am finally enjoying the summer. Do you think the sentence was fair? 25 years for trying to burn a father alive. Some people tell me I should have asked for leniency. Some people say a father should always forgive. What do you think? Did they get what they deserved, or was the justice system too harsh? Let me know in the comments below. Here is the biggest lesson I learned from this nightmare. We are taught that family is everything. We are taught that blood is thicker than water. But that is a lie. Loyalty is thicker than blood. Respect is thicker than blood. Just because you gave someone life does not mean they have the right to take yours. You have to protect your own peace. You have to build your own fortress. And sometimes the family you choose, the strangers who become friends, are the ones who will stand by you when the fire starts. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps me share these warnings with more people. Share this with someone who needs to open their eyes. Until next time, stay safe, stay alert, and watch where you step.